it does in the end make a difference in my life knowing who these people are. I wish everybody could trace their backgrounds. I never really grew up with that sense of family because my family was my dad and my mom and my brother, and my dad died early, and so I knew a couple of relatives, and I knew relatives on my dad's side of the family, but my family unit was very small. And then when all of them die, as they are now, all dead, it felt, I was surprised when my mom died of how kind of suddenly lonely I felt in a weird way. Not that I was seeing her all the time, but just the kind of sense of being alone in the universe, and that all the people who knew me as a child were dead, and that I was sort of the keeper of the stories. I was like the one who remembered, remember that time when this happened in 1981, and that was really funny or sad, or that was sort of this weight that I felt. And now one of the benefits I've had of doing this research is kind of one feels less alone in sort of the history of your life when you're able to kind of know about the foibles and the failures and successes and the lives that other people led. I think it helps.
Today's edition of the CBS Mornings Podcast is sponsored by Noom.
Hi, I'm Dr. Andreas Michaelides, Chief Psychologist at Noom. But what's Noom, and why does Noom need a chief psychologist? Noom is a weight loss program that works, with results that last, because we know that changing the way you eat starts with your mind. With Noom's proven psychology-backed tools, one-on-one coaching, and flexible plans that emphasize progress over perfection, you'll have the tools you need to change your relationship with food. So sign up at Noom.com now and lose the weight for good. That's Noom.com.
Hi, everyone. I'm Vladimir Jutis, CBS News national correspondent and CBSN anchor. Welcome to the CBS Mornings Podcast. So today, I'm so excited because I get to interview CNN anchor and 60 Minutes correspondent Anderson Cooper. He's just written a fascinating book about his family history. It's called Vanderbilt, The Rise and Fall of an American Dynasty, and it looks at the Vanderbilt's journey from essentially indentured servants to one of the wealthiest families in American history, who ultimately squandered that wealth over the course of several generations. So I'm really excited, Anderson. We're actually here at CNN. This is the first podcast we've done in real life.
Welcome. Yeah, it's nice to have someone else here. I've been wandering around the offices
just
alone.
You and yourself, the cleaning crew.
Yes. I like the happy twist you put on the word squandered.
You see, my inflection was
it was very upbeat. It made it sound, that sounds nice.
First of all, so full disclosure, I mean, anybody who's followed my career knows that you and your EP, Charlie Moore, the EP of Anderson Cooper 360, were my very first bosses in news.
I was hardly your boss. I was just a person there in the office that you were in as well. So.
Well, and also that, thanks to you and Charlie, I have this incredible career, and it's kind of full circle that I get to come here as a journalist.
I know, it's
and
a little
interview
surreal.
My mentor. I know. when the first time I came in to show you stuff that we had done in the field, and I was with my friend Hannah, who was a AP on your show, and another guy, Adam Desiderio, who's now an award-winning producer at Vice, and you said, so who's going to be the correspondent on these stories? And I was like, I am. Oh, let me see your stuff. And I showed you, I remember you scrolled, and you go, wow, you have no idea what you're doing.
Did I say that?
Yeah. And I was like, oh, no. And you said, no, that's really, really good, Vlad, because there's so many people that come up through the system that, they become calcified, and since you don't know what you're doing, you're just really natural, and we can work with this.
Well, my memory is the first time meeting you, which was I occasionally school groups will come through, from Columbia Journalism School, which is where you were attending, and CNN asked me to speak to a group from the Columbia J School, and I always like to do that, and I did. And you were one of the people sitting around this table in a conference room, much like this, and you were clearly you were just clearly a presence and a standout in this. And I remember being like, who are you? Like, what are you doing in this?
Why are you asking so many questions?
Well, there's no, just like, why are you in school? You should be in the office already. Like, what are you doing? And that's how I remember it going.
Yeah. All right. So let's talk about the book. So,
well, let me just say also, because Vlad was in Haiti with us when, you hadn't been at.
No, I just
CNN.
finished my internship. I hadn't even really gotten a job yet. I was in between. I just finished my internship and I was like freelancing basically.
Right. And we realized we could get on this plane on a JetBlue flight down to Santo Domingo the day of the earthquake. And Charlie and I were like, why don't we bring Vlad? Because you spoke Creole and you were clearly motivated and interested. And so it was Vlad did an incredible job. It was probably it was probably one of the most, certainly, if not the most intense experience, I think, for any of the reporters who were covering it, just in terms of the sheer number of horrific things that one saw and the suffering of people. And it wasn't just a story. Some stories you go on and it's something that happened a week ago and you're recounting it. This was something which was every day. It was an ongoing drama and tragedy and struggle, and every day you had no idea what the story was going to be, but all you had to do is open up, step outside, and the day took you. And I think some of the most extraordinary experiences I've had as a human and as a reporter were on that. I think we were there for a month or more.
A couple more days in a month. Yeah.
And we spent one day with a team from the Los Angeles County Search and Rescue.
That.
And it was just one of those days where they agreed to let us kind of follow them along, and they ended up at this building that had collapsed, and a mother thought her daughter was trapped inside, and Vlad ended up being the translator, not just for the story we were doing, but they didn't have somebody who spoke Creole, and they brought Vlad into the rescue operation to try to, shout into the rubble and listen to see if they could hear something. And I'll never forget the sound of Vlad yelling, on his stomach, crouched amidst this rubble, yelling into a crawl space for this little girl, and then everybody's just silent in the street waiting. It was just, again, it was one of those things that I'll never forget.
Me too. It was one of the most powerful stories I've ever covered, just being there at that moment. In all the years that I've known you, like the rest of the public, I'm fascinated by this family. I'm fascinated by a lot of these families that played a significant role in the development of this country, for better or for worse. But you have always been someone reluctant to talk about the connection that you have to the Vanderbilt, which is that you are one. I frequently would hear you talking about your dad and about his family in Mississippi, your family in Mississippi. But, when I would kid you about the Breakers or something, you seem to shy away from talking about that.
I would retreat into a very dark place.
Yes.
Yeah, I didn't. I mean, look, I didn't. I've been sort of even dreading this whole publicity around the book, because having to talk about it, it's just it's not something I've done in my life. It's not. I want to really. I mean, I don't want to sound rude to any of my cousins on the on that side of the family, because the few that I've met are lovely and are nice and are leading really interesting lives. But I just never really wanted anything to do with the Vanderbilts. I thought no good could come of it. I didn't really know much about them. My mom had a very fractured relationship with that family based on the things that had happened in her childhood. She was involved in what was called the trial of the century at the time. She was taken away from her mother, sent by the courts to live with her Aunt Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, who later founded the Whitney Museum, and who was a remarkable woman who led kind of a secret life, bohemian life, even though, to most people, she was this big society lady. But my mom had a very fractured relationship with her, so she didn't really talk about her childhood when I was a kid. The Vanderbilts to me were like ghosts that they were slightly scary. I knew that they'd had all these big houses. I knew that there was one, the Breakers, that was now a museum. And I just felt like I would, when I was a kid, I was very concerned for a lot of weird reasons about how to make a living and I was very concerned about my mom's ability to like be, my dad. I think when you lose a parent early on, you change, and many people, you realize that the world can be a very scary place. And after my dad died when I was 10, I became very concerned about like my own ability to have a life and to provide for myself. And I kind of felt like we were on this slowly sinking ship. And my mom, as amazing as she was, was not necessarily the most parental person. And I desperately wanted like a parent figure. And I sort of, tried to become my own. And I looked around for models to model what my life should be. And the little I knew of the Vanderbilts, that didn't seem like a good model. And I looked at the Coopers and from Mississippi, and I thought, you know what, that seems like a better model. Like they are real people, and they actually have, lives like everybody, and they have families, and they're a cohesive family. And so I kind of just rejected that whole Vanderbilt side. I just I didn't want to get attached to this idea of that I was from some big family that had, once had big resources and homes and lavish lifestyles. I just didn't want to get attached to that because I thought this is all going to be taken away.
So then what was it about this particular moment in time where you said, maybe it's time to look into my past?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was, over the course of my life, I learned a little bit more in like history class about the Vanderbilts, and I was like, oh, okay, I'm related to these people. But again, it still felt like, okay, well, my parents had sat me down early on. I think I was around 8 or so, and when they said, look, a lot of people are going to think, you're maybe, that you're from, they're going to know about the Vanderbilts, and they're going to think you're, maybe that's going to impact how they view you. And, we want you to know that there's not like maybe they think there's some like big inheritance that you're going to get, and they're going to say you have a lot of money and we're doing well and your college will be paid for, but there's not a pot of gold waiting for you from the Vanderbilt, from like your great-great-grandfather somewhere that's, going to be yours when you turn 21. And of course, at the time, I was like, I don't know what the hell they're even talking about. Like what? But I'm glad they did because, I don't think I would have been as motivated if I had thought there was some sort of a trust or inheritance or one of those things. So, and now, really it was the death of my mom and the birth of my son that made me kind of start to think, well, especially the birth of my son, like how do one day my son's going to start to ask about, well, who was his grandmother and, where is she and where does he come from and that sort of thing. And I didn't really know what I would tell him about the Vanderbilts because I really didn't know anything about them. And I thought, this is the time when I should start looking into this. And I started going through all these documents my mom had of personal letters from Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney and her mother. And, you started to hear the voices of these people, not, from a standpoint of them being a titan of industry or something, but as human beings, with the foibles and the failures and fears that we all have. And I just thought, wow, this is actually really kind of interesting. Like, who are these people? And we're like, what happened to them? What happened to, how was it possible that they went from being, the first one who came here was an indentured servant, and within 2 or 3 generations, this kid is born who drops out of school at 11, Cornelius Vanderbilt, and over the course of his life, from the age of 11, he starts working on a little boat that his dad had, moving supplies between Staten Island and New York, and he builds that ultimately into a steamship empire, and then later in life figures out that railroads are the future, and he builds a railroad empire and dies the richest man in the world. And then how does, within 2 generations or 3 generations, it go from that and building all these palaces to having them all torn down, essentially?
And what was the most surprising thing that you learned as you started to uncover your family history?
I was, the whole thing was a surprise to me. I mean, I didn't know my grandfather killed 2 people with his car. I didn't know.
I did note that in the book because, and people, you always sort of kid yourself and say, I'm a very serious guy, but you're actually really funny. And even in your writing, that humor comes through when you're like, in the passage in the book where you write about that, he killed 2 people. Right. That was what rich people sometimes did without any repercussions.
There were no repercussions. I mean, in the turn of the century when cars first started, the amount of like rich people who killed civilians walking down the street and totally got away with it is incredible. If you look at old press accounts, my grandfather, Reginald Vanderbilt, who died of alcoholism when he was 45 years old, his death was so violent his esophagus exploded and he splattered blood on the walls of his room as he died, vomiting blood. He was often described as a horseman. That's not a profession. So when I remember when I started reading, hearing about him, my mom would say little things. My mom didn't know him. He died when my mom was 15 months old. But I was like, that's not the model. I'm going to go for the taciturn Mississippi farmer who was my grandfather on my dad's side, with all his drama. I'm still going to go for that rather than my grandfather who drank himself to death and went through all his money and lived, just didn't really do much. Mm-hmm. And but yeah, if you want to know what privilege is, he killed 2 people with his automobile. He hit I think it was a 7-year-old boy with his vehicle who survived, but the press blamed the child.
The child, I saw that.
They blamed the child for running in front of the car, I guess. So yeah, that was America then.
It really was, and yet the patriarch of the family, Cornelius Vanderbilt, his son, who he sort of mocked, as a lot of these, you hear these stories about the Gilded Age robber barons and how they treated their offspring. Right. But it was actually his son who really doubled the family fortune.
Yeah, so Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, who drops out of school 11, could really never read or write particularly well. If you look at letters he wrote, they were full of misspellings and was very. He was, from the time of 11, he was literally on a tiny little boat with a pole, pushing the boat through the water in the shallows between Staten Island and New York, delivering supplies with his dad, like vegetables and stuff, and then got a loan from his mom and bought his own little boat, and then ran his dad out of business within a year, and then was just ruthlessly competitive and cunning and worked nonstop. And all he cared about from the time, apparently, that he was 11 years old was money. And he himself talked about having a mania for money, and it was a pathology. He didn't care about family. He didn't care about art or New York society or anything. Money was his sole focus, and money and the power and freedom that came with it. And that's there weren't many rules in business, and even if there were, he would have violated them. But he was ruthlessly competitive and extraordinary, and he had a genius for it. And he built up the steamship empire, and then bought up a whole bunch of small little railroads and formed the New York Central Railroad and Grand Central Station in New York. He founded that on land that he owned. But he had a lot of girls, a lot of daughters. He didn't care about any of them because they, in his mind, weren't really Vanderbilts, because they would ultimately be married off and they wouldn't have the Vanderbilt name. So, he didn't really think much of them or think much of their capabilities. And women, obviously, back then weren't allowed to, in that class, weren't allowed to work. They weren't allowed to vote. They had no rights, really. And all he cared about was the male members of his family. His favorite son died during the Civil War, and it was his favorite son maybe just because he died and he didn't have time to disappoint the Commodore. His other son, who history doesn't talk about, was a guy who had epilepsy, was probably gay, he had a wife, but he also had this guy who he traveled with who was his great friend. And the Commodore viewed him as weak and so ignored him. And even the one son, William Henry Vanderbilt, who would later on go on to impress his father, for most of his life, up into his 40s or so, his dad thought he was a blatherskite, a blockhead. Blatherskite.
Billy Blatherskite.
Yeah, Billy the
him,
Blatherskite.
Right?
Yeah, I had to look up blatherskite.
Me too.
It's like one of those old terms. Yeah, it means basically blockhead. But The only way it tells you about the pathology of Cornelius Vanderbilt, that what made him respect his son Billy ultimately was that Billy tricked him in a business deal, and suddenly the Commodore thought, oh, this guy actually has something, and started giving him a job with the railroad, and ultimately he gave him all the money. And he gave him, when the Commodore died, he had $100 million, which in 1877, lots of people, in the world of business today, we read about have $100 million. It's still an obscene amount of money, but in 1877, it was unheard
Billions,
of.
yeah.
It was one out of every $20 in circulation belonged to the Commodore. It was more money than was in the U.S. Treasury, and Billy got it all. And within 8 years, he doubled it to $230 million, which is just, it's unheard of. It's mind-blowing.
It is mind-blowing. And what I do find as a humorous aside is that there were other families in America who thought that the Vanderbilts were arrivistes, like the Astors, which you talk about a little bit.
No, I mean...
how they were
right.
like, we don't want these Vanderbilts,
right?
These ruffians, even though they're the wealthy.
Yeah, I mean, no, it's totally true. It was New York society viewed the Vanderbilts as, it made I wouldn't say that they were the Trumps of their day, but they were like the new money. There was this thing at the time in New York society, which was a kind of an artificial concept, and it was something that was a concept that was kind of developed by this woman, Caroline Astor. She was sort of, she had a legendary list of the 400 families that matter, which were old money families. But of course, this is in America in the late 1800s, so old is a very relative term. They looked to Europe to kind of define what New York society would be like. But in Mrs. Astor's New York, you couldn't be too close to the making of the money.
Right, couldn't work.
Right, so the Astors, initially made their money in beaver pelts. So, the first guy was traded beaver pelts. So he had the blood of a lot of beavers on his hands. And so Mrs. Astor decided that everybody had to be 2 generations removed from the bloody beaver money. So she was okay because it wasn't her father, it was her grandfather. So that was okay. The Commodore was the guy who made all the money. His son Billy doubled it. And Billy was like a tradesman. He wasn't part of a society, but his kids could be. And not only could they be, but they became society. They broke the back of Mrs. Astor's grip on society, and they did it by the fact that they, had $230 million, and they started building palaces in New York. And bigger houses that were bigger than anybody had ever seen, and one of them threw a party, which it sounds ridiculous that this is what it took, but this woman, Alva Vanderbilt, who was married to Willie K. Vanderbilt, who was the grandson, the party boy grandson of the Commodore, she was this upstart Southern woman, incredible racist, supported the South in the Civil War. She married into the Vanderbilt family, and through her sheer ambition and cunning, she got Mrs. Astor to recognize the Vanderbilts, because at that time Commodore Vanderbilt was still alive, and he was like this uncouth, guy who all he cared about was money. He had been in the war. His idea of a good time was hanging out on the wharves in Lower New York with sex workers, and he ended up dying with syphilis, and he sort of did whatever he wanted in life. And the few dinner parties he'd be invited to, he would spit on the floor and smoke a cigar and chew tobacco and curse, and he was just unacceptable. So it wasn't until 2 generations in that the Vanderbilts suddenly were able to kind of remake New York society.
And William K., the woman you're speaking of, what I found really fascinating in reading the history is the men made the money initially, and they're the ones who also lost it. You talk about your grandfather being an alcoholic and dying at a young age, but these incredibly fascinating women, especially of the generation that you're talking about. And I wrote something down about, because you mentioned that Alva Vanderbilt Belmont was incredibly racist. She was born into a Southern family. They owned slaves. And yet she became this towering figure of the suffrage movement. Right? So much so, though, I also researched her that President Obama honored her by establishing the Belmont Women's Equality National Monument in D.C., which is incredible. But she owned slaves and had slaves, and
she owned slaves as a child.
And she waxed nostalgic about that.
Yeah,
period.
no, I mean, she was Alva Vanderbilt was, there's a hit, one of the things that I found most interesting about the Vanderbilts is that, history is often written by men about men. And so when people think of the Vanderbilts, they think about Cornelius Vanderbilt. And, this is not a book about, the business accomplishments of Cornelius Vanderbilt. T.J. Stiles wrote an incredible Pulitzer Prize winning book about Cornelius Vanderbilt. There's great books. Fortune's Children is a very good book. This is really it's a human story about what was going on in the lives of these people at key moments in their lives. And for, the Commodore, it's about, who he was as a person in, behind the scenes of all this wheeling and dealing. Like, what was the pathology that was driving him forward, and how did that pathology, that mania for money, infect the subsequent generations? And it did, for often for worse, sometimes for better, but often for worse. But there's the Vanderbilt women who come into the family very often are fascinating characters, and had they had rights at the time, they could have been titans of industry themselves. I mean, Alva Vanderbilt's, the cunning and intelligence she used to break into New York society and then marry her daughter off into this loveless marriage to some British, count or duke, because she wanted her daughter to have a title, and that would help her socially. Alva Vanderbilt is born into a Southern family, supporters of the Confederacy during the Civil War. They go broke. They come to New York. She ends up she's not very attractive. She doesn't have any money left, but she's smart and she's funny, and she snags Willie K. Vanderbilt. And she goes from being this complete racist. I mean, not only it wasn't just that her parents owned slaves or had enslaved people. She regaled with stories of how she sort of used to torment the children of the enslaved people, enslaved children themselves. And, she had completely racist notions of black people. And, but later in life, and we talk about, it's an interesting turn that the book takes. After, selling her daughter off essentially to British nobility in a loveless marriage, which doesn't last, she does a 180 and divorces Willie K. at a time when nobody got divorced. And she did it saying, you know what, I'm divorcing this guy. I'm gonna sue for divorce, and had to convince an attorney to do it. And society rejected her. And she was like, you know what, I'm going to do this because this is like women should be able to do this, and women are going to follow me in the future. No one's doing it now, but in the future they will. And then she funds, with the money that she has, the suffrage movement, and funds organizations even of women of color in the suffrage movement. So it's a bizarre turn, and we spend time in the book trying to understand how one person can have such kind of wild swings and different, just kind of different chapters of their life that seem diametrically opposed. And the irony is that I think it was 2016, President Obama goes and dedicates this building as like a historical monument, praising her.
Yeah, it's incredible. And that's what I really honed in on in the book, which is these incredible women. You already mentioned Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, who I find incredibly fascinating.
Yeah.
You write this about her: not content to merely consume what others told her she ought to value according to her class prerogatives and wealth, as Vanderbilt had done for generations before her, Gertrude yearned to create, to express, to change. It kind of speaks to who you are in a way.
Yeah, I mean, when we were writing that, I mean, it to me, it's very much my mom also, of somebody who got pulled in a lot of directions. And Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney was, married to Jock Whitney, very wealthy man. So she really had two fortunes behind her. He ultimately died, but he sort of lived a life of playing polo, and she had no interest in that. But she played the part of a dutiful wife in society. But she also had this whole other kind of secret bohemian life in Greenwich Village, actually just a few blocks from where I live. She was a legitimate sculptor, very talented. She did a whole bunch of monuments that are still.
You can see one in Washington Heights. There's a beautiful one for World War I. There's a World War I monument in Washington Heights.
Titanic monument. In fact, that image in the movie Titanic of them on the bow with the hands spread, I believe that's a reference to the Titanic monument that she made, actually, which has a woman with her arms spread like that, or a figure. But she lived this whole artist life in downtown, and not only was she an artist, she also collected American art, and she tried to, at a certain point, give all of her American art paintings that she'd collected to the Metropolitan Museum, and they were like, no, we're good, thanks. And so she was like, all right, well, fuck you. And she founded the Whitney Museum. So that's why there's a Whitney Museum in New York, because the Met was like, American art's not really all that important. So, I mean, she was really a visionary. And the sad thing to me about that is she's the one who, was involved in this suit to have my mom, as a child, taken away from her own mother. And Gertrude succeeded. Gertrude had the money and the power, and my mom later in life came to believe she had good motivation for doing it and felt she was doing the right thing. The sad thing about it is my mom ended up living at Gertrude's house in Old Westbury, Long Island, and they never really connected. They never had a real conversation about stuff, about what had happened, or, Gertrude was very close to her brother Reginald, my grandfather, who died, but they never even really talked about my mom's dad to my mom, who didn't know her father. And, my mom was this little kid growing up with this fascinating woman who was an incredible artist, but my mom, and my mom was very interested in art from a young age, but they never even connected on that level. And so it was a real kind of, just to me, it's one of the sadnesses and the sort of the isolation that so many of the people in the family seem to have throughout their life. And I don't know if it was the money that isolated them, or just the stultifying nature of kind of society at that time. There's just a lot of misconnections, and it's, you see it as from the outside, the sort of glamour and luxury, but as you scratch away at the surface, there's a lot of sadness and isolation and complexity.
One more person to bring up as we bring it into the 20th century, which is Gloria Morgan, your mother's mother, your grandmother. That whole trial of the century, the very first trial of the century, she was involved in. Obviously, she was your mom's biological mom. This was coming off the back of the Lindbergh baby kidnapping, and
right.
There were a lot of people who were concerned. People forget, and I didn't know this until I did read Fortune's Children, but I read it very many years ago, that your grandmother was very young when your mom was born. She was basically a kid herself, and your grandfather was in his 40s already.
Right.
So she wasn't even legally able to be a mom, right? Back then, which is why Gertrude Whitney felt the need to maybe intervene.
Yeah, basically, my mom's dad, my grandfather and my grandmother, Reginald Vanderbilt, meets this beautiful young 17-year-old girl, Gloria Morgan, who's an identical twin. So she has an identical twin sister, Thelma Morgan. Thelma is the one who introduced Mrs. Simpson to
Edward VIII.
To Edward VIII.
Wait, while she's not around,
right?
Edward, you can talk to
Thelma
Wallace.
was having an affair with Edward VIII for a couple of years, and then she had to go back to New York for something, and so she said to her friend Mrs. Simpson, "Hey, would take care of him," and Mrs. Simpson certainly did, and that's why he ended up abdicating. But Gloria Morgan meets Reginald Vanderbilt, and at that point, Reginald Vanderbilt is 43 years old. He's broke. He's got serious cirrhosis of the liver, and they end up getting married. He was upfront with her about his financial situation, but I think she kind of felt like, yeah, sure, okay, fine. He's a Vanderbilt, though. Like, I'm sure
it'll work itself out.
It'll work out somehow. He seems to be living a lavish life anyway, killing people in his car.
Yeah, I remember also not just killing people in his car. He owed his newspaper guy. Isn't that a great detail?
It kills me too. When I learned that when he died, he was deeply in debt because he'd inherited $7 million or something, which is it's a huge amount now. Was an astonishing amount then. We're talking about that's probably like $60 or $70 million, the equivalent. But when he died, his debts, when you look at who he owed money to, I mean, it was like the laundry woman who had been washing his clothes. The newsstand on the corner, he owed something like $200 and something to, at a time when a newspaper cost a penny.
Right. So it's like thousands of dollars today you would owe to the newspaper guy.
He'd been stiffing this poor newspaper guy, like, oh, paper, Mr. Vanderbilt, yes. Oh, get me tomorrow? Yeah, sure. Years go by of that. I mean, it's really awful. It's truly, truly awful. And even when he met Gloria Morgan, so Gloria Morgan was 17 years old and actually was a friend of Reginald Vanderbilt's daughter, who also was about 17 years old, Kathleen, from his previous marriage, who he really didn't see very much. He meets Gloria Morgan, her friend, and all of a sudden he's starting to see his daughter Kathleen more because they're on like double. It's like Reginald and Ciaz calls up Kathleen and be like, hey, Kathleen, let's go for ice cream. Why don't you bring your friend Gloria Morgan?
That's so creepy. Kathleen's
happy that Reginald's like paying attention to her. Her dad's paying attention. And so like they go out for ice cream and she doesn't realize that Reginald and Gloria Morgan are a thing and ultimately going to get married. And they go out for ice cream and like Gloria Morgan and Kathleen Vanderbilt are like eating ice cream and he's sipping absinthe. Right. I mean, the whole thing is just so bleak and crazy.
I know, it's nuts. And they're like at the same debutante balls, right? Because they're practically the same age.
And then they get married and Kathleen like is furious and she never saw my mom until my mom was 15 years old. So Kathleen was my mom's half sister. And again, one of those kind of misconnections, never really got to know each other. She's actually, I found her gravestone. She's buried in Havana in a cemetery in Cuba because she ended up marrying a Cuban guy. And again, she died in her 40s too of alcoholism.
And your mom was basically, part of the issue, I guess, was that, first of all, Kathleen's inheritance was split because when Reginald died, Gloria Morgan inherited some money, even though she'd only been married for a couple of months or a couple years.
So Gloria Morgan, there was no money really. The only money that existed was a trust. Reginald's father, my great grandfather, Cornelius II, had set up a trust for Reginald and for Reginald's children whenever he had children, and it was like $5 million, which in 1924 was again like $60 million. And so my mom, who was an infant, had half of a $5 million trust waiting for her that she would get when she was 21. Gloria Morgan had no money. Reginald dies without money. Gloria Morgan has to pay off his debts to the newspaper person. I hope he got paid back. And actually had to sell all his possessions in order to get that money to pay off the debts. And then Gloria Morgan decides, well, I'm 18 years old or 19 years old now. I've got a kid. I've got money as long as I'm, raising this kid has money. So Gloria Morgan, who has no money, is now in a position where she, as long as she is the mom to my mom, as long as she acts like a mom, she can get money to live on from my mom's trust. So my infant mom is paying for her mom's lifestyle. And so Gloria Morgan decides, all right, I'm going to go to Europe and have fun because I'm a widow. I have the Vanderbilt name and I, have access to a $5 million trust. And so she goes off to Europe with my mom and my mom's nanny, who my mom really was like a mom to my mom, really was my mom's mom. And Gloria Morgan brings her mother along. And they live in Europe for 8 years. My mom was raised for the first 8 years of her life in Europe. She spoke French. She didn't know anything about the Vanderbilts. Just sort of heard whispers about them, but had no idea what it was about. And it wasn't until, my mom's 8 years old, she comes back to America. And it's so bizarre, such a bizarre story. But my mom, my 8-year-old mom, her nanny and her grandmother, so her mom's mom, the nanny and the grandmother hatch a plan to have my mom taken away from her own mother and to go and live with Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. And they have this plan, which is basically to get Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney to see that Gloria Morgan is unstable, unfit to be a mother, and that the child is sick and at threat of being kidnapped and may die or may be kidnapped and needs to be taken away from her mother, that she's being moved about in hotels. And that's what the trial of the century was about. It was the result of a plan by my mom's nanny and her grandmother to have my mom taken away from her own mother so that she could live with the Vanderbilts. And it worked. And that's what happened. And my grandmother lost custody of my mom and the money that came with it. She no longer had that trust to, and it was an event that changed the course of my mom's life forever. It changed the course of a lot of people's lives. And it was a terrible thing for an 8-year-old or 10-year-old child to be put through.
Yeah. And you also write about the fact that there was maybe one thing that they shared in common, Gloria Morgan, your mom, was that they didn't have fathers. And I thought that was sort of interesting. These are women in a time when it's hard to be a woman, even if you are wealthy, and to not have a dad around could also be.
Yeah. My mom often quoted a writer named Mary Gordon, who said that wrote that a fatherless girl thinks all things possible and nothing is safe. And my mom felt very believed that quote, that sentiment very strongly. Yeah. Again, my mom and her own mom never really connected. My mom grew up, the first 8 years of her life with her mom going out to parties in Europe and being moved from hotel room to hotel room and rented chateaus and stuff, all of which my infant mom is paying for, unbeknownst to her. But she had no idea who her mom was. Her mom didn't want to be a mom. She had no idea how to be a mom. What came out in the trial also was that her mother, Gloria Morgan, had relationships with women as well as with men. And that at the time in 1932, at the time of the trial, that was scandalous. I mean, the court shut down. There were newspaper headlines about it. And she was accused of being a lesbian, which was one of the very strong reasons why why my mom was taken away from her mother, because the irony is Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney also was having relationships with women. So, the fact that Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney was willing to use that in court against her is interesting.
Yeah.
But yeah, my mom grew up terrified of her mom and grew up, there was a period of from 1945, 46 until like 1960 that they didn't speak. My mom had no connection to her mom. She stopped giving her money. She stopped helping her. And it wasn't until my dad came along that he sort of got my mom to reach out again to her mother and then have them reconnect. But, my mom said that they never had a conversation about what had happened. They never, even as adults, before her mother died, they'd never discuss like the trial or any of it. It was all just, like a cool breeze that had passed them by, and they never spoke about anything of consequence.
Didn't your mom say, I don't know if it was to you or in relation to a question maybe you asked her about the past, that it's too exhausting to talk about it? It's so complicated that it can be exhausting.
Yeah, that's in the book. What she said, well, I was asking her why she never really talked about her childhood and stuff when we were kids growing up, because my dad was always talking about, growing up in Mississippi and the farm, and we knew his family's names and stuff. I didn't know. I literally, until I wrote this book, I would always get like Willie K and William H. Vanderbilt confused. I couldn't have picked them out of a lineup. I couldn't have told you exactly. I couldn't have run through how I'm related to Cornelius Vanderbilt. I couldn't have said like, yeah, it's Cornelius Vanderbilt, then his son, the Blatherskite, and then his son, Cornelius Vanderbilt II, and then and then my grandfather, and then so it's my mom just didn't talk about it, and she said later in life to me she was like first of all, your father had such great stories about his growing up, and she felt like her only option was to lie, like to make up stories, because how do you tell a kid, like after your dad has been telling you all these great stories growing up on the farm, that like, well, actually I was taken away by the courts, and
right.
I grew up.
Cut my mother off.
Right. I didn't know my mother, and I never spoke to her, and I had a nanny who I loved, just like you have a nanny who you
Dodo.
love.
Her name's Dodo.
Right. And just like your nanny who you love, my nanny was taken away from me by the courts. So, my mom was just like, it's just too exhausting to try to even explain. Like, and even she couldn't, my mom spent her life trying to kind of replay the events of her childhood and put them into a an order that made sense to her and to kind of understand. And it was later in life, like she came to kind of rethink how, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney for a long time was viewed as the enemy by some people. The America during what was the trial of the century, just like with the OJ trial, obviously in different ways, people took sides.
Yeah.
And there were people who, were like, Gloria should stay with her mother. And there were protests outside the court every day. There was like the mothers faction of mothers, need their children and children need their mothers. And then there was a Gloria Vanderbilt, there was a Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney faction of like, she's a lesbian, it's unconscionable, take her away. So, it was a lot to come from. And the other reason I hesitated even writing this or even associating with it for a long time is like, I sort of feel like even speaking about it, in the world where most people, look, these are people living in beautiful houses, riding in fancy cars, literally burning, money, not literally, but burning money in a way that's really unconscionable. And so I always was, I'm even hesitant talking about it now because it's a little bit like, oh, boo-hoo, wow, who's going to really cry tears over, people living like this. And I totally understand that perspective. And I, which is why to me, what's interesting about the book is just the human story of these people. The trappings are obviously larger than life and it's obviously a different time. But it's to me, just, human beings are human beings. And it's interesting to see how somebody is actually living the moments of their life at a time when we think, from an outside perspective, they have it all and they should be, enjoying themselves or, contributing or doing something, but they're as, screwed up as anybody else.
And so when Wyatt comes to you and asks you about that statue,
well, now I can just give him the book, but because I'm not sure how I feel about it. I mean, I'm not sure. I started into this looking at the Commodore and thinking, God, this guy's ruthless. All he cared about was money. Didn't care about, the daughters in his family. He, his son who had epilepsy, he mocks and doesn't really support. And, his son ends up shooting himself in the head in a hotel room. And, maybe he knew he was gay. Maybe he didn't. I don't know. But it just seemed like that's so not anything in my mindset. It's that kind of mentality of I'm not interested in business. I'm not like, obviously it's very nice to make money. But I'm not, I didn't go into a profession where I thought I was going to be able to make a lot of money. But I came away actually kind of, when I saw what happened to the rest of them, when I saw how sort of that money infected the next generations, I started to kind of almost to admire some of the Commodore a lot more. I mean, he was a genius and he was ruthless, and cunning, but he also worked incredibly hard and, all he did was work. And I still wouldn't, want him to be my dad, and I wouldn't want him holding power over me in any sense.
Right.
But would I want to a dinner with him would be kind of interesting, even if he's spitting and cursing and
and
belching,
cigars and putting them out on the road.
Right, exactly. It would be kind of interesting, but it's I don't. The book is not. The book starts out with a quote by Mark Twain about Commodore Vanderbilt, and it's not a
nice one.
It's not a nice quote. Yeah.
You also have these interesting passages in the book, actually every chapter begins with a word or blurb from Amy Vanderbilt's Book of Etiquette.
Right.
What was the idea behind that?
So Amy Vanderbilt's Book of Etiquette, which I don't think now is in anyone's...
In circulation?
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's in circulation anymore. But for decades, that was sort of the book of etiquette. For those who wanted a book of etiquette, which I guess people did, because Amy Vanderbilt seems to have made a living out of having a book of etiquette, and it's all these ideas on where the knife and fork go, but it's also just what to do on a boat, how to behave, and I mean, it's just kind of ludicrous, crazy, stuff that just looks ludicrous now. So I found it funny. And it actually, that wasn't actually my idea. So I have an amazing co-author named Catherine Howe, who's a novelist and a historian. And I'd written 2 books by myself, but I had never written a history book. And she was like a breath of fresh air in the creative process, and looked at things through an outsider's lens that, sometimes I was very involved in, like especially with stuff relating to my mom. She was able to help me kind of, look at it through a different lens, and she's a great writer, and the book is way better because of her work. So she had the idea, and at first I was like,
she had the idea.
Yeah, it was Catherine. And at first I was like, Amy Vanderbilt, I don't like this. It's kind of is it snarky, and but I came to really like it, particularly when I found out Amy Vanderbilt is sort of a Vanderbilt. Like, I mean, yeah, I guess she's sort of related, but there's a lot of like Vanderbilts floating around, and some of them are related and some more tangentially, but they happen to have the name. And by the way, I'm very glad I don't have that name. But so when I heard like, oh, she basically kind of was like riding that, and you have this idea that like, oh, Amy Vanderbilt, she was like the Commodore's wife, and she wrote this book of. And she's not, like, I don't know who she is.
Yeah, she's just a random.
I mean, she's a relative. She is some lady.
Yes, but that's funny.
Right. And also that there's a quote for everything in those Amy Vanderbilt
really
books
is.
of like, what side of the boat you should smoke your cigarette on so that the ashes don't get in the sail. I mean, okay, yeah, I guess that's good advice.
So great, so great. Well, that what I was going to say is that is why I think the book is fascinating, and people are really going to love it, because I think that the last time I interviewed you was with your mom for the book that you wrote together, and I still had that picture as my banner on my Facebook, and people ask me, well, why do you have Gloria
She was dressed
Vanderbilt?
was she dressed in like a space costume, like a silver outfit?
No, it was silver. It was silver.
It was like an astronaut's outfit, I think. Yeah.
But I remember the reason it was, to me, as a journalist, as a reporter, and somebody who's uniquely who's keenly interested in American history, like Gloria Vanderbilt is probably the closest I've ever come to Marlon Brando or to Howard Hughes or to Gordon Parks, right? And like she
came close to all of them.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, do you want to talk about how you had to edit her book and like all the lovers that she...
Yeah, so my mom wrote at one point a book, a romance memoir about sort of many of the relationships she had, and I use the term relationships loosely in some ways. But and she asked me to copy edit, and I was like, really, Mom? First of all, at this point, she's like 85 or something. I was like, I gotta go through this. And she like with Marlon Brando, she hooked up with Marlon Brando, and it was her and her friend Carol Matthau, who was married to Walter Matthau, and previous to that, she was married to William Saroyan, the playwright. Anyway, they were great friends. They both saw, it must have been Streetcar Named Desire, and they were at the movies, and both like, we should hook up with him. Like, it would be great to hook up with him. Carol apparently hooked up first, and then she hooked my mom up to hook up. And I believe that's how it happened. My mom didn't use those terms, but I'm translating into modern terms. So my mom like went out to LA and spent the night with Marlon Brando, and that was their relationship. But yeah, she had, I mean, it was crazy, relationship with Frank Sinatra, and for several weeks, and they were friends for the rest of their lives. And Gordon Parks was a lifelong, love that they had, and relationship, I think, on and off throughout.
He turned you on to journalism.
I mean, just by example, Gordon Parks, who, for those who don't know, because I don't think enough people know about him, he was the first black photographer at Life magazine. He was the first black director of a major Hollywood picture. He directed Shaft. He was a poet. He was a writer. He was a genius photographer. He conducted, he composed music. He was just this extraordinary, like, Renaissance guy who had an incredibly tough childhood upbringing, and he and my mom he was taking photos of my mom, I think, for Life magazine in the early 50s. He was black, and they connected, and they had what became a lifelong friendship. And he used to come to our house all the time, and my mom would give him. We had a house in the Long Island, and if he was writing a book and wanted some quiet time, he would just stay there for months or however long to work. And he was just the coolest guy. I mean, he drove this. I think in my memory, it was a green Jaguar, and which he would like. I remember him saying like, "Oh, I'll give it to you when you die." And my mom spoke at his funeral, and there were like a dozen people there who he had promised that car to. We're all like, wait a minute, he did that to you? But he was just an incredible guy. And I knew he was a photojournalist. He was, he took incredible pictures of the Nation of Islam, just incredible photo spreads in Life magazine. And his work is still very present, and there are shows of his work. But he was the first journalist I knew, and he just was kind of this like, swashbuckling, towering figure. And I thought, wow, like, I want to be like him. I mean, I want to be able to go travel the world and tell stories. And he wrote a book called Flavio about a kid in a favela in Brazil. And
now you live in Brazil. You have a house in Brazil.
Yes, yeah. But I mean, I just thought it was this extraordinary thing. Is wait a minute, you can travel the world and drop in people's lives and document their lives and learn from them. And it was mind blowing to me.
I love it. I'll ask one last question before we wrap this up. When we last spoke in a formal setting, your mom was with us, and I asked you about having kids, and your mom turned to you. It was one of those rare moments in an interview where it's like kind of unscripted, and she's like, "Yes, Anderson, you used to talk about it a lot, and now you don't talk about it anymore." And then you were looking at me like, "Gee, thanks, Vlad." And I remember thinking to myself, "I hope I'm not in trouble," because she seemed to be really intense, and you were like, "Mom, traveling, the work, and now you have Wyatt. You and Ben, you're raising Wyatt with Ben, and who is the kind of guy, if people don't know Ben, they probably might not know from this podcast. He's the kind of guy when you go into a room, like he likes everybody talks to him. He's like very
he's much more interesting to talk to than I am.
Not more interesting.
No, it's true. I traditionally have had a holiday party for everyone from the office and stuff, and Vlad has come many times, and I am like a recluse socially, so I just am like focused on like making sure
we have our drinks,
things are moving along, and Benjamin's actually the one who's talking to people, so people.
But now you guys have a son, and what's that like?
We're not a couple, we're not partners anymore in that sense, but we are partners we're co-parents and we're family, and he's amazing. He never really wanted to have. Benjamin never really wanted to have kids, which is probably one of the reasons that we separated. But he is my family. As I said earlier, I don't really have but my parents and my brother have died, and so he's the person I rely on most. And I knew he would be a great dad. He has amazing nephews and a niece, and he kind of for much of his life felt like that's enough. That he loves them, and but once I really decided to move forward with this, and we had broken up, he was involved in, I would talk to him about it, and by the time Wyatt was born, he was there and in the delivery room, and I gave him Wyatt to put on his chest. They call it skin to skin, where the baby's just born and they're on the skin of the parent. So he did that first, and he was just like bawling. And I don't think I'd ever seen him cry before. And I mean, maybe once or twice, but I was like, "Who are you? This is like what?" So he's a great parent, and I mean, I could not imagine doing this without him. And it's been extraordinary. It's been it's probably an unusual arrangement where we live together, but we are united by this little kid who is just amazing and fun and so happy and giggly and just got a sly smile, and there's really nothing better. I sort of can't imagine having lived so long without having Wyatt in my life. So
I love that. And he saw him walk first, right? You were on assignment for 60 Minutes.
Yes.
And that's a bummer in a way, because I wondered if it was the first time you ever said to yourself, "I wish I wasn't on this goddamn story."
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah, I got a text from Ben saying, "Wyatt walked!" ! I was like, "Are you kidding me?" This shows you what kind of upbringing I had. My first thought was, I can't believe you didn't just lie about this and not not tell me this? Like, are you kidding me? Like, why wouldn't you just lie about
lie.
it? Yes. Then, of course,
He's not a Vanderbilt. What do you...
Yes. Oh.
I, like the rest of the world, eagerly wait those Instagram photos, those few times that you post little Wyatt photos on Instagram.
When are you?
Oh man, I'm like Ben. I'm an uncle, and
okay, all right.
seem to. But there may be at some point in the future. I would like to have kids. I mean, if anything, for
You're
some
not
of the
getting
things
any younger.
I know I'm not. I'm like way past the age of expiration date here. But just because, in a way, of what you've written about and what we've talked about here. You want someone to tell the story to, all right? And
yeah, exactly. I mean, to me, the book really is kind of, I view it as a letter to my son. My dad wrote a book called Families before he died, and it was all about his family and his family's history and the family he was born into and the family he made of me and my brother with my mom. And that, I mean, it's literally, it's like a touchstone in my life. It's something I read every year. Or if not more than that. And so many of my memories are connected with that book. And I'm not even sure if I actually remember them as events that I was there or if I just remember them from reading them so often. But I want this to be something that my son can read in the future and kind of see his family through a human lens, and regardless of what may be in a history book about their accomplishments or their monuments or whatever it is, business achievements, that stuff doesn't really interest me. What interests me is who these people were as human beings, and what were their motivations, how did they deal with the situation that they were in, what were their fears, and what was their motivation, and were they good people or complex people? And I want him to make up his own mind and not feel, I don't want him to feel what I felt, which was kind of this avoidance of these Vanderbilts, because I thought, I don't want any association. I want to chart my own course. I don't want people thinking I'm just like working. I remember once being on, I think the first time I was on Oprah's program, I'd written a book, and she very kindly did a whole hour on the book. And, I'm a huge Oprah fan, obviously, and always have been. But she said something to me like, well, you don't have to work.
Yeah, you're a Vanderbilt.
Right, you don't have to work, and which is a comment I've heard a lot throughout my life. And, I mean, just technically it's not true, but...
Did you tell her you were a child model? That's how you started earning your first paycheck?
I did, yeah. But it's always interesting to me that people immediately had that assumption. And so it's one of the reasons I didn't want, when I walk into a room, to have people know the first thing is, it's the Vanderbilt guy. Because all the connotations and all the associations with that have nothing to do with what my life was actually like growing up or how I lived my life and how I live my life now. So, it's taken me a long time to even kind of want to look at these people. But I think my son will be, I think he'll be able to look back at this as people from the past. But I think the future is his to write, and his future is his to write. And for him, T.E. Lawrence said, in the movie Lawrence of Arabia, which is one of my favorite movies by David Lean, Peter O'Toole playing T.E. Lawrence says, nothing is written. Nothing, meaning, nothing is preordained of how something should be. And I think for my son, that's really the case. I think, I hope nothing is written. I hope he gets to write his own story and, chart his own course.
Anderson Cooper, thank you very much.
Thanks.
The book is called Vanderbilt, The Rise and Fall of an American Dynasty. My name is Vladimir Dutil. You've been listening to the CBS Mornings podcast. I'll see you on the next one. Thank you very much.
In 1968, Americans were introduced to something new.
This is 60 Minutes. It's a kind of a magazine for television.
5 decades later, 60 Minutes is America's most watched news program.
You believe this is the toughest challenge humanity has ever faced?
Absolutely.
But if you miss the TV broadcast, you can listen to full episodes as a podcast.
That's really clever.
60 Minutes, Sundays on CBS, and available anytime wherever you get your podcasts.